Hi, and thanks everyone. Thanks for coming, everyone. Today we're going to talk about things that are correlated with gender diversity in ASF projects, which we've done as a data science stroll through online logs. The first thing is, what is this all about? Holden, what is this all about?
Well, so there's a few things. One of the things is there's not a lot of metrics around open source diversity to begin with. There's certainly some, but there's a lot of raw data that we can use to make some metrics. And then maybe from these metrics, we can find interesting ideas. We can't prove causal links, but we can find interesting ideas for things to try in our open source projects and see if they help at all. It's also a fun use of Jupyter and Spark. And we put ML in the abstract, but yeah, we just did some correlations. It turns out the linear regression model was kind of garbage. But pull requests are totally welcome if you want to try and make it less garbage. That would be greatly appreciated.
Right. She exaggerates a little bit. We have notebooks to go along with this project that pull data and do the correlations and have some very interesting follow-on questions, and we'd love help on them. So who are we? We've been friends for a long time, and interestingly enough, we have almost nothing in common. So I'm a New Yorker. Holden's from San Francisco. Wants you to follow her on YouTube.
Yeah,
I am completely different. I want you to not follow her on YouTube. But we do actually believe that variety and diversity and differing opinions can actually make life and everything else more fun. Of course, whenever you're looking at correlations and biases, we all have our own. We all have more in common than we have different. We both live in large cities in the coast, and we're North American techies. And we have a shared appreciation for the Cheesecake Factory, which maybe you should tell that story.
The Cheesecake Factory actually plays a very surprisingly important part in this presentation. So we were actually dining at we can call it dining at a Cheesecake Factory together.
Fine dining.
Some might say eating. I wouldn't use the word enjoying. But we were at a Cheesecake Factory, and I was thinking about how we ended up at this Cheesecake Factory. In fact, how we ended up at this Cheesecake Factory twice in the span of a week. And I was thinking about how the Cheesecake Factory really does a great job of illustrating how consensus decision-making results in not bad, but certainly perhaps not our best experiences from time to time. And the Cheesecake Factory also represents a kind of diversity where there are hundreds of things on the menu, but in fact they are all also just starch and butter with different amounts of salt added depending on your personal taste. And so that there is a certain amount of diversity of Cheesecake Factory as well.
I feel like that's an interesting take, but the reason we wound up there was not consensus. It's because we were trapped in a blizzard at a conference. And it was the only place we could go to eat.
That is not true. There was a PF Chang's.
Okay. Well, we ate there too.
Yeah.
So there were two places we could eat, and we ate at both of them.
Yeah, but we ate at Cheesecake Factory twice because of consensus decision making.
Right, well, we're just going to have to disagree to agree to disagree.
Fine.
All right.
Fine. Oh wait, no, you forgot about the part where we don't talk on behalf of our employers, because this is one of those things.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Don't take what I say to represent Google's views here, but definitely, if you like them, give my employer money. Okay, cool.
So most of our slides are not going to have lots of text for you to read. We just think there's some interesting historical perspective that's useful to mention. So the first is actually from a story about women at Newsweek having to sue to become writers. It's a very famous court case in the 70s. And here's a quotation from someone who was asked about it at the time. He said, basically, no women are actually interested in becoming writers. If they were interested in being writers, they would come to us. And that clearly was not true, because there were something like 50 people in that court case before they won. It's interesting to look at some current things that we see, like people saying, I never worked with women, they weren't interested in working this project. Many people actually believe that, but we know that there's often lots of interest that may go underreported. Curiously enough, there were some studies done on GitHub logs and by some others with some curious statistics, like if you reveal that you're a woman when you have a commit to push, it is less likely to be accepted. Another is that women report a much higher degree of being exposed to language they're uncomfortable with. and content they don't like in chat discussion groups and mailing lists. And one of the things we were looking for is if we pull actual data and do some science, do we see correlations between participation and what people actually report as problematic? But we do know statistically from these samples, this seems to be more of an issue for women, or according to these studies.
So we did some things that, if one is drunk, you could call science. We pulled data from a bunch of different sources. Most of the data that we pulled was mailing list and data from different Git repos to look at commits, and also mailing list posts and sentiment analysis and things like this. The ML magic, we can disagree on that one, apparently.
Like everything else.
We agree on some things.
No,
cheesecake. Okay, fine. And since it's JupyterCon, we use Jupyter. But yeah, we also looked at, Jupyter was one of the projects that we looked at, as well as Interact as well. But don't worry, I assure you that in amongst all of the Apache projects, you can't actually see it on any of the graphs. Cool.
Okay. Some quick disclaimers, things you won't be able to get from this. It's not necessarily academic quality data because of the size of the data logs we're able to pull. It's not legal advice.
Yeah.
And while we can identify some strong correlations, obviously that's not the same as causation. So it's important to remember that.
And to be clear, if you attempt to use any of this in a court of law or as legal advice, LawyerCat will destroy you with their laser I-beams. And yeah. Right.
Okay, so data sources and methods. We pulled from Git commit logs, project websites, and mailing lists. And we inferred the gender using some basic ML techniques.
Yeah.
And then also had some sampling done by people to validate a subset.
As someone who's inferred gender from the computer systems does not match my own gender, I thought it was interesting and important to include a second data set as well with humans. And humans, of course, bring their own biases. We'll talk about that later. But we have essentially two different ways of trying to guess the gender of the participants in the open source projects. Okay, so there are 50 top-level ASF projects, about 30 gigs. That are active.
Active.
Yeah.
30 gigs of commits and posts that we were able to use in our data mining. And then within that, we had, using Mechanical Turk, we sampled down about 1,600 code contributors out of the 15,500 or so in total. And all 2,600 committers, we had humans try and validate independently as a way to validate the model that we had.
The sample sizes were chosen based on my corporate credit card limit without review, which is $500. So we spent $499.95 on data collection. But it is actually a statistically significant sample. We did it segmented per active project, and it's not. It wasn't just cost savings.
So let's talk about how the project actually went. It's like almost anything else you do with analytics. The first stage is to pull some data, do some simple graphs, and eyeball to see what you can find out. So that's actually what we did. So what do ASF and Jupyter projects look like, Holden?
Well, there's a variety of projects. Also, this is, since it's the first graph we showed, I thought it would be important to not make it with Jupyter. And so this is done inside of Google Sheets, and I'm sorry. But I needed the aggregate data, and it just happened to be there faster. We can see there's a bunch of projects with sort of null, like no women are participating in them. And that's unfortunate. They're not all just small projects. HTTPD is one of them, I think, for active contributors. But we can see that they all sort of cluster around 0.1-ish. And there's a fair amount of variability, but we have one exciting outlier, which either means we have a data quality issue or we have an exciting project. And the nice thing about this is the sampled human data, and doing it with the gender inference also gave us a pretty similar number for that project. So I was more confident it wasn't just a data quality issue, it was actually something interesting, or as you say.
Right. Well, so you can see that the participation rates vary a lot. Oh, so some of them are as low as...
Do we want to do questions? We should have talked about this beforehand.
Yeah, we have a section for questions at the end.
But we could...
Okay, so we're going to disagree.
Okay.
So I guess that means we'll take the question.
This says percent.
Yeah.
So that's actually 60%.
It is actually
Yes,
60%.
yes, the label is wrong.
Okay, sure. Sorry. Yeah. No. This was the joy
Yes.
of Google Sheets. I should fix that before we upload the slides, but I probably won't.
Yeah.
I'll just add a note at the bottom.
If only someone had said something about that beforehand.
Fine.
Right. So yes, those are 0.6 to 60%. We should have clarified that when we pulled this up. But the rates vary from small single-digit percentage numbers to about 20%. There's a fair amount of variability, and then there's one really tall bar, which we thought we'd look at, or to use the data science term more formally, hey, what's that tall bar? So we looked it up, and it's a project called Aravata, which we weren't familiar with either. It turns out to be a distributed computing monitoring tool, often used with cloud projects.
Yeah, I think I just made that up when we were talking.
That's not true, because I went to the website independently.
And it did say cloud?
Yeah, well, I didn't believe you, so I looked it up.
Okay,
right,
okay.
So, so that's what this tall bar is, and it's clearly an outlier, and we were wondering, well, let's take a first crack at why is it an outlier, and see if there are any reasons. So again, this is just superficial looking to see what do we find out. The things we noticed, it's an academic funded project from the NSF. There's a huge base of companies that have actually funded it. And it's very easy to see how to get involved and find the community page right from the page you go to. So maybe those things are relevant. Obviously, it's a small statistical size, so we don't really know. But part of what we're looking for is what things are stronger correlations. But this is what we saw from eyeballing. You have anything to add to that?
No,
Okay.
none whatsoever.
How about now?
Yeah, still no.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So then we move on from eyeballing to stage 2, which we call sciencey-ish.
Inspired.
Science inspired, right? Where we actually pull more data.
Yeah, and so we looked at a number of project attributes. And so in addition to finding the percentages of the contributors, we also wanted to know what things were correlated with them. And some of these are things that we didn't bother doing because I ran out of time. But we did look to see if projects had code of conducts and how easy they were to find. If there's a stated way for people to become committers. And in ASF speak, committer is someone who can commit code to it without review normally. There's slight variations in review then commit, and then commit then review projects. But it's essentially like a position of respect and authority. And they're often the people you go to with tricky questions. And if the project has a contributing guide, because we saw that one project with the high percentage of contributors had a really easy to find contributing guide. And what the sentiment on the project user development list is. And this is, my belief is that perhaps negative sentiment, so people being very negative towards each other, might turn off different groups of people at different rates. And this could be one of the things that could be correlated with a project not having great diversity. And PR acceptance rate we didn't actually look at, but another study did that one. And we would also love your suggestions, like it's a notebook, we can add more things to our list to study pretty easily. Or you can with a pull request, because I am lazy, according to my performance review. Okay, moving on.
And to be fair, the notebooks are available on GitHub. You can pull them. And it was set up in here to run on the cloud. It does run on a single machine.
If it has 32 gigs of memory.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
I think we can make it smaller. But if you have 32 gigs of memory on your machine, it can run right as soon as I upload the instructions.
Yeah, just use the cloud. And what that gives my employer money.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, and so in addition to those, these were some of the things we were going to look at and see if they were correlated. The idea is gender percentage of code contributors and PMC/committers, essentially the project management group. And I meant to do it for mailing lists, but then the sample sizes exceeded my budget of $499.99. And so that's going to have to be saved for future work, also known as Holden's next expense submission cycle, which is very soon, and we'll follow up on that.
Right. So we actually pulled this data and did the correlations and pulled them up and got some results.
Yeah.
Actually inside of Jupyter, right?
Yeah, inside of Jupyter, which is renowned for its visualizations.
So would you guys like to take a look? Yeah. Great. Okay, so here was the first thing we pulled, and we looked at this for a while and thought, maybe our eyeballing method is not as good. on this one. So we can make some minor changes, right, and produce a better slide.
But I want to be clear, this is the default view for the data frame when you collect it back to your local host. So this is the default view that you get.
Right.
And it's really, as we can see, an excellent view to.
Right. Not that we're lobbying for a different default.
No, never.
So we then pull this again, and you guys want to see that? Yes. Great. Oh, okay. Much better.
And so
much better.
This is the show method, which implies that this is how you would want to look at your data.
Yeah. So here we have a long list of numbers, and we thought, well, we can look at this a little bit, but maybe we want some pictures. So we actually pulled this up and did some. We plotted together.
Yeah, we plotted together.
And we started with these two slides. Now, the labels are too dense to read on these slides, so we break them out in a little more detail. But this is to show the correlations of essentially gender participation against a series of variables we pulled. So I mentioned before, some of this is from the notebook and some of this was validated independently by humans on Mechanical Turk. And we wanted to know, do they actually agree for the most part? And for the most part, they do, although there's one problem which we actually think is our fault, which we'll discuss.
You and I disagree as to the source of that problem.
I think it's your fault, but okay. All right,
Fine.
So moving on. We talked a little bit about differences, and when we were looking at the differences, we wanted to attempt to validate some of the methodologies we used, like let's double check the sentiment analysis from the logs actually pulled, and let's look at the gender inference, and I'll let you take that one.
So there's a few things that could be wrong. Inferred gender is known to have issues, right? This is not surprising. It infers my gender as male. It probably actually doesn't have a great inference for Boo's gender either. It does pretty okay on Matt, but it has an American bias because there's census data and lovely things there. So it could be a problem with our gender inference, which could explain why we're getting different results from these two. It could also be that maybe our sentiment detection isn't so great because the one that's varying between the two is the sentiment analysis. So I spot checked it like a good engineer. I'm not legally allowed to call myself that in Canada, but
sample size of 2.
Here in America. Yeah, sample size of 2.
Solid engineering.
I didn't quite get to engineer's induction, which is 3, but we're pretty close. And so I want to read these 2 quotes. Thanks. I think it still needs a bit more work, but that had no negative sentiment and was mostly positive. And the other one is who fucking broke the build. And that had a largely negative sentiment and no positive sentiment. And so for my sample of 2, I think that our sentiment detection is probably world class. And I don't want to look for 3 elements because that could disprove my theory, and that would.
And you'd have to use induction.
Yeah, oof, yeehaw. And so the human data collection, this is the question we ask them. If you find something wrong with this, maybe you actually do real things with collecting human data, please let us know. And next billing cycle, I can ask people the question again. But that's, yeah.
Right. Okay, so here's a look at some of the actual data and the results we got. We circled a couple of things to explain what's actually there. So the blue circle in the lower right is actually correlation between what the code came up with what humans detected. So it's above 0.8, which means they have a strong positive correlation. So for the most part, our software results agree with what people came up with independently, relatively across the board, with a notable exception, which we'll discuss later on.
Yeah.
The second thing is, if you look, the green circle is a set of attributes tied to the sentiment in the mailing groups. And essentially, positive sentiment strongly correlates with increased gender participation. So we actually broke this out into quartiles and buckets, and worst, which is why there's more than 1 point. But you can see they're all positive in the green. And also on the left side, the ones in red are negative sentiments. And according to this, the negative comments in and negative sentiment in the mailing group seems to strongly correlate with lessened gender diversity, which is kind of interesting. Again, our sample size is in the few dozens of gigabytes for these 50 projects. We're not saying correlation and causation are the same, but it's an interesting result that agrees with some other studies done previously.
Yeah.
We also found some things we were actually confused by, which is actually the stuff, well, more than one thing, but on this slide anyway. The bit in yellow actually says that if you have if a mentoring guide exists, there's a negative correlation. It's not a strong negative correlation. It could easily be a side effect of the relatively small number of projects, right? Because there are only 50 data points for that, whereas sentiment across gigabyte is much more reliable, but it's sort of interesting.
So diving more into the mailing list posts, we can see that the positive sentiment max and average are both positively correlated, and that's what I expected, and so that's kind of happy and makes me feel good when I get the answers I was expecting, although that also is somewhat questionable because that's the point which I stop investigating any data correctness issues. So who knows? And we can see that it doesn't really make a big difference between the different quantiles that we measure that at. One of the things which I think is really interesting for the negative sentiment is you can see here we have the positive sentiment max described, but the negative sentiment max was not less than negative 0.2, and so it wasn't relevant. It was closer to the 0 mark, and so your average negative sentiment and your 90th percentile negative sentiment matters, but you don't have to worry necessarily about that one post to the mailing list that's like by that one asshole. But it does seem to say, like, if 10% of your posts to your mailing list are by assholes who are being jerks to people, that's not a good sign. So you should probably still deal with assholes when they show up on your mailing list posts before it gets out of hand. But don't worry that like one person is going to completely screw you over. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. And so the rest. One of the things which I was also happy to see is that the percentage of non-mail committers was positively correlated with the percentage of non-mail contributors. This is not overly surprising. Certainly sometimes I will go to a project's webpage, look at the list of contributors and see a distinct lack of dinosaurs. And then I'm like, whoa, there are no other dinosaurs here. I'm just going to go and find a more dinosaur-friendly project for me to contribute to. And so this is not too surprising, and that's kind of cool. The committer guide existing being weakly negatively correlated, this could just be that data point. We only have a sample of 50. It could also be that you add your committer guide, for example, in response to realizing that you don't have a lot of diverse committers, and that could be a thing. We can come up with all kinds of different explanations to fit our data, but it's more fun to do it the other way around. And I think there's another slide. Oh yeah, and so let's talk about the inferred data and why it made me sad. So I mean the non-mail committer percentage still was positively correlated. Here we have the positive sentiment being negatively correlated. And we disagree as to the likely cause of this. You think it's that we just don't have enough samples, and that's definitely quite possible. I think that it could be that there's issues with how well the gender inference works, especially affecting perhaps more marginalized communities could be more impacted by the problems with gender inference, and that could skew our data set. But it's all right, we agreed to disagree and just share this with y'all so you can make your own decisions, and then we didn't have to have that cage match in the speaker's room because there just was not enough room. Yeah, it's fine.
I just assume it's a bug. So,
okay, right, okay, so you just assumed that I wrote the code wrong, which is also equally possible. I should have pointed that out. I thought you just thought our data set was not very good. Which could be quite right. So we started out with looking at some historical challenges in other industries. And the parallels in the quotes were perhaps a little on the nose, one could say. And they did a bunch of interesting things. I was really hoping that we would see a relationship with things like the committer guide or contributor guide being much stronger, because that resembled some of the solutions that were done where they made explicit training or mentorship programs and stopped just hiring their friends. But that wasn't correlated at all. There was a thing you wanted to say here, but I don't remember what it was, so it's going to go back to you.
Right. Well, a lot of these are actually historical challenges related to the earlier court cases. It's sort of an interesting question of, if you want to increase participation, what should you do? We don't have any magical answers, but a lot of what we did here seems to agree with some earlier studies and amplify them. For instance, the tone on the mailing list and sentiment certainly seems to be important, and we can also see there are definitely wildly varying rates, and groups that have been more successful. And so it's interesting to find out what else can be done, because we know that sometimes people say, well, there just aren't there aren't women interested in this project, for example, and that's probably not true.
Yeah.
Just a slide here. There are both some related projects and also links to the places where we pulled the quotations from earlier, if you're interested in reading more. One of them, someone did gender diversity analysis in the Linux kernel across time, which also has some interesting data points. You can see the increase of rate of commits by women over time, going back to, I think, 2006.
I don't know, I didn't read the links.
Yeah, okay, some of us did our homework, right?
I was making the notebook.
Oh, sure. It doesn't actually show you as a percentage, unfortunately. It's just absolute number of commits. So they're actually, this was obviously a lot of fun for us to work on. But there's some really interesting potential follow-ups that other people could do, like analyzing how does this actually change over time, right? We have 50 projects, but this could also be broadened out. And there are live streams of the pulling of the data early on and doing processing. And of course, links to the notebook, which will actually prettify up a little bit so that you can run on a single machine.
With 32 gigs of memory.
With 32 gigs of memory. I'll make it smaller. It'll work.
Just buy a cloud instance. You forgot about the part. Come on, man. You can't skip that part.
No, go ahead. You go for it.
Man. It's way less.
Okay, fine. So anyway, there's a link here to the data processing and collection. And, you guys may not know this. I didn't. But it turns out it's performance season at Google. And
I'm not saying
also,
this.
You probably don't know this, but they're actually very metrics driven. Actually, this is a strange. I don't remember writing this. My manager's name is not Steve. My manager's name is not Steve. I don't know whose manager's name is Steve in Seattle.
If you happen to know a Steve working out of Google Seattle who manages, DAs, just.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a link to the live streams if you want to watch them here,
or even watch them on loop.
Right.
Yeah, with the volume. This is being recorded.
Yeah.
All right.
So we'd like to express a special thanks to Ann Spencer. So why don't you say something about it?
Yeah. So while Matt was busy in New York, Ann Spencer and I met a lot early on with some of the data collection and figuring out things that we were going to poke at, with seeing what things might be correlated. She's the wrangler of cats and unicorns as the head of content at Domino Data Lab. And we first worked together on my first O'Reilly book together, and she's amazing. And without her, this notebook would just be like 6 things that I kind of thought of while drunk, as opposed to like semi-organized and actually maybe being useful. And so this is good. And you can read her blog. I think Domino Data Lab is also a very metrics-driven company. So if you wanted to, read her blog several times a day, I don't think she would object in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, she was very helpful in outlining a number of ideas for this, and was present from the outset. So we'd like to thank her.
Was she at the Cheesecake Factory with us?
Yes.
She was.
But
okay.
Not the time when we actually came up with the talk.
Okay. The second time?
The second time.
Okay.
Yes. The second Cheesecake.
The Cheesecake Factory is indeed key.
So if anyone's interested in participating, we've actually set up a few things. There's a forum that we've just created if anyone wants to discuss this.
Completely empty.
Completely empty. Well,
very neutral sentiment. But
right. The notebook, here's a link to be able to access the notebook.
And the bit.ly link may produce metrics if you were figuring which link to click on.
And these slides are also posted. And these are our Twitter handles, or you can come by and talk to us here or at Strata. Or
yeah, you're going to Strata, right?
Yeah, I'll go. It's here. I'll go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and so completely unrelated to this talk, but that should not stop you from buying several copies of this book. One of my O'Reilly books is called High Performance Spark. This is the one where I found out you can negotiate royalties. And so I encourage you to buy several copies with your corporate credit card. If you don't have a corporate credit card and you want a free copy, there's a book signing at $320. And even if you do have a corporate credit card, come by and get a signed one, and then we can, also buy many copies online with your corporate credit card later. Just don't return them. It creates a hassle. And cats do love it. Mostly the box it comes in, but that should not stop you from buying it.
Any more for your pitch?
Just buy this.
I'm just checking. Okay, yeah. So anyway, you can go and get your copy signed at $320. Yeah. So we had a lot of fun putting this together. Any questions?
Oh, if you could pretend that you're happy, I can take a picture of you all being happy and clapping from my boss. If you could just do that again. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you. It is perf season. It opened yesterday.
Did we mention it's perf season for Holden? I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Was gender inferred from the name, or?
Yeah, so for the inference, so the question is, was gender inferred for the name? And for the inference one, yeah, it was just done from the name, which is why it has all of these problems with just depending on name data from US Census data for determining gender. That's a great question.
Yes.
Do you use an API for the name?
Oh, great. So the question is, do I use an API for the name? And the answer is, I tried two different things. There was a library which just shipped with some pre-baked data set. And for the name one, I also looked at using Genderize. And that returned null less often, so that's the one that I went with. It also told you the sample sizes and stuff, so you could discard low sample sizes if that's a thing that would matter for your work. And so that one might be better. They want money, but again, less than the $500, so we're good.
But we found that they're pretty good, and they agree pretty well with what people came up with independently.
Yeah. Although humans bring their own biases.
Well, sure. So one of the issues is which biases come into which data set. So what we found is for a lot of the name detection, they tend to be biased towards Western names much more. And so that can cause its own skew, interestingly enough. Yes?
Two things. First off, did you run into the situation, and so how did you handle if there was a unisex name?
Oh, yeah, that's
Great question.
Can you put up the links slide again?
Yep.
Yeah.
totally. And so, yeah, we actually also tracked male, female, and NB, and also null. We discarded nulls, but we kept NB. The humans found one, which was sad, but also perhaps reveals some amount of human bias with assigning genders to people. You can read the text of the question, and if you're so inclined from my slide share, and see if maybe there was a way we could have phrased it better to get them to more accurately correctly identify MB folk. But yeah. They're in there, but there was only one entry, and so I didn't call it out separately on all of the graphs. I just grouped it together with women for now, as non-male.
Cool. Any other questions? Great. Thank you for coming.
Cool.